They did something small for you today. Maybe they handled something before you had to ask. Maybe they remembered a detail you mentioned once. Maybe they kept the day moving while you barely noticed. And you appreciated it. You just didn't say so. Not because you didn't care, not because it didn't matter, because somewhere along the way, saying it started to feel unnecessary, already understood. But what feels obvious to the person who didn't say it rarely feels obvious to the person who didn't hear it. And that is how people start to feel invisible in relationships. Today, I want to show you 7 things that most people in long relationships stop saying, and what the absence of those things does, quietly, over time. None of them are difficult to say. Most of them take less than 30 seconds. That's what makes the silence around them so costly. My name is Daniel Mercer, and one of the things I've noticed consistently in how emotional distance grows in relationships is that it rarely happens through what people do wrong. It happens through what people stop doing right. In the early stages of a relationship, people say things. They express what they feel. They name what they notice. But over time, that urgency fades, replaced by the assumption that the other person already knows. That love, at this point, should be self-evident. But love is not self-evident to the person receiving it. They don't have access to what's happening inside you. They have access to what actually arrives. And when what arrives stops including the things that matter most, the relationship starts to feel different, even when everything else looks the same. Here are the 7 things that stop arriving. Number 1, I notice what you do. Not a general thank you, not a perfunctory acknowledgement, but the specific, named recognition of something the other person did, that you saw, that registered, that you're choosing to name. I noticed you took care of that before I had to ask. I noticed you remembered what I said about that. I noticed you stayed calm when things were difficult. These moments happen constantly in long relationships. The other person does things, small, consistent, unremarkable things, that keep the shared life functioning, that show care, that require effort even when the effort is invisible. And most of the time, those things go unacknowledged. Not because they're unappreciated, because they've become part of the expected texture of the relationship, part of what's assumed. But to the person doing them, they're not assumed. They're choices, made repeatedly, quietly, without recognition. And over time, the absence of recognition doesn't just feel like oversight, it starts to feel like invisibility. The person isn't asking to be praised, they're asking to be seen. And seeing someone, specifically, named, out loud, is one of the most important things a relationship can do, and one of the first things it stops doing. Number 2, you were right. This one is simple, and surprisingly rare. Not in the middle of an argument, that's a different conversation, but afterwards, when things have settled, when it's clear, in hindsight, that the other person saw something more clearly than you did. You were right about that. I should have listened. You called it before I did. These moments happen more often than they're named. One person's judgment proves out. The situation resolves in the direction they predicted. And the other person, who resisted or dismissed or simply didn't listen, registers this privately, files it, moves on. But they don't say it, because saying it feels like a concession, or because the moment has already passed. Or because they assume the other person knows they know, and saying it out loud would just be awkward. What the other person actually experiences. They were right. Nobody said so. They notice this. They don't say anything about it either, but they notice. Over time, a person who is consistently right and consistently unacknowledged starts to feel something specific. Not resentment exactly, more like a quiet erosion of confidence that their perspective is actually valued. That when they see something clearly, it will matter. Number 3, I'm proud of you. This one surprises people when I raise it, because it sounds like something you say to a child, not to an adult partner. But pride, specific, genuine, expressed, is one of the most powerful things one person can offer another. Not the general kind, the specific kind. I see what you did. I understand what it cost you. And I think it's worth admiring. I'm proud of how you handled that. I'm proud of what you've built. I'm proud of the way you showed up even when it was hard. Most adults spend very little time hearing that someone who knows them well is genuinely proud of them. The people around them may be impressed, or supportive, or pleased, but pride, spoken directly, by someone whose opinion actually matters, that's rare. And when it comes from a partner, someone who has seen the full picture, who knows the context, who understands what the achievement actually meant, it lands differently than it does from anyone else. Number 4, I miss you. Said to someone you live with, someone you see every day. Not missing their physical presence, but missing the version of them that was more present, more engaged, more reachable, the version that existed in a different season of the relationship or a different season of life, or sometimes, more simply, missing the connection that's been harder to find recently. Not because anything went wrong, because life got busy, because the rhythm of shared days doesn't automatically include real contact. I miss us is one of the most vulnerable things one person can say to another, because it requires admitting that something has been absent, without blaming, without accusing, without demanding. Just naming a longing for something that used to be more available. Most people don't say it, not because they don't feel it, but because saying it feels like a risk. Like naming it will either create conflict or reveal something that the other person will feel unable to fix. So it goes unsaid, and the longing stays private, and the other person, who may be feeling the same thing, or who may be completely unaware, continues in the same rhythm, unaware that the person beside them is quietly missing them. Two people in the same house, both slightly lonely, neither saying so. Number 5, I'm not okay right now. Not a dramatic announcement, not a crisis, just the honest admission that something is hard, that you're struggling with something, that right now you are not as fine as you appear. In long relationships, people develop a kind of emotional self-sufficiency. They learn to manage their own states, to not burden the other person with every passing difficulty, to handle things privately, especially the things that feel small enough to handle alone. But what that self-sufficiency communicates, consistently, implicitly, is that this is not a space where you show up unmanaged. And the other person receives that message, even if neither person ever said it out loud. And the person who never says, I'm not okay right now, is not protecting their partner, they're keeping them at a distance. And over time, the other person stops asking, not because they stopped caring, but because the answer is always some version of fine. And they've learned to believe it, even when it isn't true. The vulnerability that relationships are built on, the willingness to be seen when you're not managing well, becomes less and less available. And the connection that was built on that vulnerability starts to thin. Number 6, you make things better. Not thank you for dinner, not that was helpful, but the direct, unambiguous statement that this person, their specific presence in your life, makes things meaningfully better than they would otherwise be. Things are easier because you're here. I'm better at things because of you. My life is different in the ways that matter because of who you are. This is the kind of statement that gets made early in relationships, when everything is still being discovered, when the other person's effect on your life is novel enough to name, and then it stops being said. Because the effect becomes the background, because you've adapted to it, because you no longer notice it the way you once did, the way you notice a change before you get used to it. But the effect is still there. The person is still making things better, in the hundreds of small ways that don't get named, that don't get counted, that don't get noticed until they're gone. And the absence of that statement, over months, over years, doesn't just feel like a missed compliment. It starts to feel like a question, one the person can't quite ask out loud. Does my being here actually matter to you? They don't ask, but they wonder. And the wondering, sustained, starts to change something about how present they allow themselves to be. Number 7. I choose you, still. Not at a wedding, not in a moment of crisis, not as a response to a threat or an insecurity that needs to be managed. Just in an ordinary moment, in an ordinary week, the unprompted acknowledgement that this relationship is a choice. That if you were choosing now, you would choose this. You would choose them. In long relationships, choice becomes invisible. The decision that was once active, conscious, deliberate, renewed, gradually becomes assumption. The relationship is what it is. The person is who they're with. The question of choice doesn't come up because it seems settled. But for the person who never hears it, it doesn't always feel settled. There can be a quiet, persistent uncertainty, never quite named, never quite resolved, about whether the other person is here because they want to be, or because of everything that would have to change if they weren't. And that uncertainty, even when it's small, even when it's mostly managed, creates a kind of background noise, a low-level insecurity that the person learns to live with because there's nothing specific to point to. Nothing wrong exactly, just the absence of something that would make it feel right. I choose you, still. Said without occasion, said without prompting, said because it's true, and because the person beside you deserves to know it more than once. Here's what these 7 things share. They're all expressions of something the person already feels. They're not performances, they're not strategies, they're the things that are true and that, for various reasons, stop being said, because they feel redundant, because they feel awkward to say after a long silence, because they feel like they should be obvious by now, because the relationship has moved into a phase where certain things are just understood. But they're not understood, they're assumed. And assumption and understanding are not the same thing. Understanding requires evidence. It requires the thing to actually arrive, in words, in gestures, in specific named acknowledgments that tell a person, I see you, I value you, I choose you, deliberately. Still, when that evidence stops arriving, not because the feeling stopped, but because the expression of it did, the relationship still functions, but it stops feeding the people inside it. Here's what I want to say before you leave. If you heard yourself in the person who stopped saying these things, the person who feels them but stopped expressing them, I want to be clear about something. It's not cruelty. It's not indifference. It's one of the most human tendencies there is, to stop narrating what feels obvious, to assume that love, at a certain depth, is self-evident. But love is not self-evident to the person receiving it. It's felt through what actually arrives, through the specific, named, deliberate things that say, I see you. I mean this. You are not invisible to me. And if you heard yourself in the person who stopped hearing these things, the person who has been living with the absence of them, I want to say something equally clearly. The absence doesn't always mean what it feels like it means. Sometimes it means the other person has simply gotten comfortable, got distracted, let the expression lapse without registering what that costs, which is worth naming, not as an accusation, as a need, a specific, honest need for the evidence that you matter, that you're seen, that the choice that brought you here is still being made. If any of this felt familiar, I want to offer something that requires almost nothing. Pick one of the 7 things on this list, just one, and say it today. Not because it's required, not because something went wrong, because it's true, and because the person you're with deserves to hear it. I notice what you do. You were right. I'm proud of you. I miss you. I'm not okay right now. You make things better. I choose you, still. Any one of these, said genuinely, lands differently than you might expect. Not because the words are powerful, because the act of saying them is. It says, I thought about you specifically. I noticed something specific about you. I chose to tell you instead of keeping it to myself. That's what most people are waiting for. Not grand gestures, not elaborate proof. They're waiting for it right now. Not for proof that love exists, for evidence that they are not invisible.